On a crisp autumn morning, 5 years before the horrifying discovery was made, the Appalachian foothills hummed with a deceptive serenity. Leaves, aflame with crimson and gold, whispered secrets as a gentle breeze swept through the ancient forests of eastern Kentucky. It was here, amidst this breathtaking tableau of nature's artistry, that a man named Silas Blackwood set out for what he believed would be a routine deer hunt. Silas was not a novice to these woods. They were etched into the very fabric of his being. A third-generation hunter, he knew every deer trail, every hidden creek, every stand of old-growth timber as intimately as he knew the lines on his own weathered hands. He carried with him the weight of generations, a quiet legacy of resilience and respect for the wilderness. His rifle, a well-oiled extension of his arm, had been his grandfather's, its stock worn smooth from countless expeditions. His pack held the essentials: water, a compass, a map he had meticulously annotated, and a sandwich prepared by his wife, Elara, whose worry was a familiar shadow clinging to his departure each year. Yet, this particular morning, an imperceptible chill, colder than the season dictated, seemed to cling to the air, a silent prelude to the unfolding tragedy. Silas had promised Elara he'd be back by nightfall. Their daughter, young Lily, had a school play, and he wouldn't miss it for anything. He kissed Elara's forehead, ruffled Lily's hair, and with a final wave, vanished into the embrace of the forest. The sun, a pale orb in the early morning sky, cast long, dancing shadows, painting the path ahead with fleeting patterns of light and dark. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his senses finely tuned to the symphony of the woods, the rustle of squirrels, the distant call of a hawk, the snapping of twigs underfoot. He found his chosen spot, a familiar clearing near a gurgling stream, where the deer often gathered at dawn. He settled in, blending seamlessly with the underbrush, his patience as boundless as the wilderness around him. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing light and the rhythmic chirping of unseen insects. The solitude was a balm, a sacred communion with nature that fueled his spirit. But as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery hues, an unease began to settle over him. The deer, usually abundant, seemed to have vanished. A profound silence descended upon the woods, broken only by the incessant thrum of his own pulse. It was a silence that spoke of absence, of something profoundly wrong. As dusk began to creep in, wrapping the forest in its shadowy embrace, Silas decided to pack up. He'd try again tomorrow, but as he turned to retrace his steps, a profound disorientation washed over him. The familiar landmarks, the twisted oak, the moss-covered boulder, the distinctive cluster of pines, they seemed to have shifted subtly, unnervingly. Panic, a cold serpent, began to coil in his gut. He consulted his compass, then his map, his brow furrowed in concentration. His training and experience should have guided him. Yet the forest, which had always been his sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth. He walked, then hurried, then ran, the fading light intensifying his growing terror. The setting sun, once a comforting presence, now seemed to mock him, its fiery glow casting grotesque shadows that danced and stretched into menacing forms. He called out, his voice hoarse, but only the mocking echoes of the wilderness answered. Night descended with a swift, merciless finality, plunging the forest into an impenetrable blackness. The cold intensified, biting at his exposed skin. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam a meager defiance against the overwhelming darkness. He stumbled over roots, scraped against thorns, his heart hammering against his ribs. The realization dawned on him, stark and terrifying. He was lost. Back home, Elara's anxiety grew with each passing minute. The school play had come and gone, Lily's bright smile slowly fading into a worried frown. Calls to Silas's cell phone went straight to voicemail. She tried his hunting buddies, then local law enforcement, her voice trembling with a fear she tried desperately to suppress. By midnight, a small search party had assembled, comprised of family friends and local volunteers, their flashlights piercing the inky blackness of the forest edge. Hope, a fragile flame, flickered precariously in their hearts. Days turned into weeks, then months, each passing moment deepening the chasm of despair that enveloped the Blackwood family. The initial, frantic search efforts, hundreds of volunteers, trained search and rescue teams, helicopters crisscrossing the vast expanse of the Appalachians, yielded nothing. No trace of Silas, no discarded gear, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the ancient earth. The wilderness, so often celebrated for its beauty, had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a raw, aching void in the lives of those who loved him. The forest kept its secrets, impenetrable and indifferent. The community mourned, then slowly, reluctantly, moved on, the memory of Silas Blackwood fading into whispered legends, another cautionary tale of the unforgiving mountains. Alara and Lily, however, remained trapped in a purgatory of unresolved grief, their lives forever altered by the vanishing act of a man who loved the woods and was, in turn, consumed by them. For 5 long years, the disappearance of Silas Blackwood remained a chilling enigma, a cold case gathering dust in the annals of local law enforcement. The initial fervor of the search had long since dissipated, replaced by the quiet resignation of a community accustomed to the capricious nature of the Appalachian wilderness. The vast, untamed forests, with their labyrinthine hollows and imposing peaks, had swallowed countless souls, turning them into whispered legends, cautionary tales passed down through generations. Silas, it was presumed, was just another victim of the unforgiving mountains, perhaps a fall, a sudden illness, or an encounter with a wild animal, a tragic but ultimately explainable end. Alara, however, refused to surrender to such a passive acceptance. Her grief had calcified into a relentless obsession, a burning need for answers that gnawed at her soul. Every rustle of leaves, every distant siren, every unfamiliar face passing through town rekindled a flicker of hope, swiftly extinguished by the harsh reality of Silas's prolonged absence. Lily, now a young teenager, carried the quiet burden of a childhood shadowed by loss, her memories of her father vivid yet tinged with the unbearable ache of his inexplicable vanishing. The old Blackwood farmhouse, once a beacon of warmth and laughter, had become a mausoleum of unspoken questions, its silence punctuated only by the mournful creak of the porch swing and the distant cry of a lonesome whip-poor-will. The turning point came not from a renewed police investigation, but from the unassuming hobby of a local amateur archaeologist, Dr. Arthur Finch. Dr. Finch, a retired history professor with a penchant for solitude and ancient mysteries, spent his autumn weekends meticulously mapping forgotten Native American trails and unearthing flint arrowheads in the deeper, less-traveled sections of the forest. He possessed a scholar's patience and a field anthropologist's keen eye for anomalies. On a particularly warm October afternoon, much like the one Silas had vanished, Dr. Finch was exploring a remote gorge, a place so dense with rhododendron thickets and tangle vines that few dared venture there. He was searching for evidence of a rumored Cherokee settlement, a small encampment believed to have existed for centuries, its memory now all but erased by the relentless march of time and nature. He stumbled upon it quite by accident, a peculiar cluster of rocks that seemed too deliberately placed to be a natural formation, almost like a crude cairn, hidden beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient, gargantuan oak tree. This oak, a silent sentinel that had witnessed centuries unfold, dwarfed all others in the vicinity, its gnarled limbs reaching skyward like supplicating arms. It was a landmark of immense power and presence, yet it was not one Silas had ever mentioned, nor one known to local hunters. Curiosity piqued, Dr. Finch began to clear away the dense undergrowth, carefully removing layers of decaying leaves and tangled roots. The air grew heavy, almost oppressive, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Beneath the stones, a faint metallic glint caught his eye. With a trembling hand, he reached into the disturbed earth, his fingers closing around a small, tarnished object. It was a pendant, intricately carved with the image of a stag, its antlers reaching towards a crescent moon. His breath caught in his throat. He knew this pendant. He had seen it on local news reports years ago, displayed in grainy photographs, a heartbreaking plea from a grieving wife. It was Silas Blackwood's pendant, a cherished family heirloom he always wore. The discovery was a jolt, a violent rupture in the quiet peace of the forest, shattering the long-held assumptions of a simple, tragic accident. This was not merely a lost item. It was a sign, a definitive marker that Silas had indeed been in this impossibly remote, forgotten corner of the wilderness, far from any established trail or logical hunting ground. And if his pendant was here, what else lay beneath the ancient oak? The implications were chilling. Why would Silas, a man who knew these woods intimately, venture so far off course, into such an isolated and unforgiving terrain? And if he had simply succumbed to the elements, why was his pendant deliberately concealed beneath a pile of stones, almost as if hidden or purposefully left behind? A knot of dread tightened in Dr. Finch's stomach. This was no longer just an archaeological curiosity. It was a crime scene 5 years in the making. He carefully marked the location, took several photographs with his aging digital camera, and then, with a heavy heart, retreated from the silent judgment of the ancient oak. The serenity of the Appalachian foothills had been irrevocably broken. The forest, once a place of beauty and solace, now harbored a darker secret, a silent testament to a hidden horror. The true story of Silas Blackwood's disappearance, it seemed, was far more sinister than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The discovery of the pendant under the gargantuan oak was not an ending, but a terrifying new beginning, tearing open old wounds and unleashing a fresh wave of dread upon the unsuspecting community. Dr. Finch's discovery sent a seismic shockwave through the local community, reverberating far beyond the quiet academic circles he inhabited. The initial call to the sheriff's department was met with a mixture of skepticism and weariness. 5 years was a long time. The case was cold, the leads long exhausted, and the collective memory of Silas Blackwood's disappearance had faded into the realm of local folklore. Yet, the undeniable evidence, the stag pendant, unequivocally identified by Alara Blackwood as her husband's, demanded attention. It was a tangible link to a man who had simply vanished, a physical manifestation of a mystery that had haunted a family for half a decade. Sheriff Brody, a man whose tenure had seen countless lost hikers and hunters, but few genuine mysteries, reluctantly assembled a small team. The remote location, accessible only by a grueling, hours-long trek through dense wilderness, immediately complicated the investigation. Helicopters were dispatched, not for rescue this time, but for reconnaissance, their rotors beating a grim tattoo against the ancient silence of the mountains. They provided aerial views of the area, revealing the sheer isolation of the gargantuan oak and the treacherous terrain surrounding it. The journey to the site was arduous. Investigators, accompanied by forensic specialists, navigated through treacherous ravines, scaled slippery rock faces, and battled through impenetrable thickets. The dense canopy of the towering trees created a perpetual twilight, and the air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. When they finally reached the ancient oak, its immense presence felt almost sentient, a silent witness to untold events. The cairn of stones, still precisely as Dr. Finch had left them, was meticulously documented and then carefully dismantled. Beneath the earth, the first chilling discoveries began to emerge. Initially, only fragments, a rusted buckle from a hunting boot, a few buttons from a jacket, their fabric long since disintegrated by the elements, and then a small, twisted piece of metal. This last item, no larger than a man's thumb, was meticulously bagged and tagged. It bore the distinct marks of having once been part of a two-way radio antenna, a type commonly used by hunters to communicate in areas where cell service was non-existent. Silas Blackwood had always carried such a radio, a crucial piece of safety equipment. The discovery of the antenna suggested a violent end, a struggle that had torn the radio apart, rather than a peaceful, natural demise. As the forensic team delved deeper, the disturbed earth began to yield more. Human remains, fragmented and scattered by the passage of time and the relentless work of scavengers, were painstakingly uncovered. The scene was one of profound desecration, a stark contrast to the natural beauty of the surrounding forest. Every bone fragment, every shard of fabric, every speck of disturbed earth was treated with the utmost care, photographed, mapped, and then carefully collected. The process was slow, methodical, and emotionally draining. The air grew thick with unspoken questions, with a palpable sense of horror. This was not the scene of a simple accident. The scattered remains, the deliberately concealed pendant, the broken radio antenna, all pointed to something far more sinister. The team worked under a shroud of oppressive silence, broken only by the chirping of cicadas and the occasional, hushed instruction from the lead forensic anthropologist. The remote location, while preserving some evidence from casual discovery, also meant that the crime scene had been exposed to the elements and animal activity for 5 agonizing years, making the task of reconstruction immensely challenging. Among the scattered remains, another artifact emerged, a small, dark object that initially blended with the earth. It was an arrowhead, ancient and exquisitely crafted from flint, unlike anything a modern hunter would carry. Its presence at the scene of Silas Blackwood's demise was profoundly perplexing. It was clearly of Native American origin, thousands of years old, an archaeological treasure in its own right. But what was its significance in this modern tragedy? Was it merely a coincidental find, disturbed from its ancient resting place by the violence that unfolded here? Or did it hold a deeper, more chilling connection to Silas's death? The question swirled, deepening the mystery rather than clarifying it. The forensic team, typically focused on the immediate evidence of a crime, found themselves grappling with an artifact that seemed to belong to another era, another story entirely. The presence of the arrowhead introduced a jarring, almost mystical element to the grim reality of the discovery, hinting at a narrative far more complex than a simple hunting accident or even a random act of violence. The Appalachian wilderness, always steeped in ancient lore and forgotten histories, seemed to be revealing a darker, more intricate tale through its silent, scattered clues. The initial forensic analysis of the unearthed remains confirmed the darkest fears. The bones belonged to Silas Blackwood. The identification was made through dental records, a painful confirmation for Alara, who had clung to a fragile thread of hope for 5 years. But the manner of death remained elusive. The scattering of the remains, the extensive decomposition, and the activity of scavengers made it difficult to pinpoint a single, definitive cause of death from the skeletal evidence alone. However, the discovery of the broken radio antenna and the deliberately concealed pendant under the cairn of stones strongly suggested foul play. Silas Blackwood had not simply wandered off and died. Something violent had occurred here, under the silent gaze of the ancient oak. The presence of the ancient arrowhead was the most baffling piece of the puzzle. It was meticulously crafted, far too old to be a modern hunting tool. Its inclusion at the scene begged countless questions. Was it merely a coincidence, perhaps a relic uncovered by Silas himself, or did it hold a more sinister connection to his demise? The thought that an ancient artifact could be woven into a modern murder mystery was unsettling, almost sacrilegious. Sheriff Brody, a man of practical mind, initially dismissed the arrowhead as an unrelated curiosity, a distraction from the grim reality of a possible homicide. But Dr. Finch, the amateur archaeologist who had made the initial discovery, argued passionately for its significance. He presented a compelling case. The arrowhead was not just any ancient relic. It was a distinctive type, associated with a particular Native American tribe known to have inhabited these mountains thousands of years ago, a tribe whose legend spoke of sacred hunting grounds and severe punishments for trespassers. While modern sensibilities might scoff at such notions, the profound reverence for the land, the deep spiritual connection that permeated indigenous cultures, was a historical fact. Could a symbolic act have been committed here, perhaps by an individual or a group with an extreme, anachronistic belief system? The theory seemed outlandish, bordering on the fantastical, yet it gnawed at the edges of the rational mind. The silence of the forest, once comforting, now felt pregnant with ancient echoes, with forgotten warnings. The lack of any other obvious weapons or ballistics evidence further complicated the investigation. There was no bullet casing, no knife blade, no blunt object that could definitively point to a murder weapon. The ground around the oak, though meticulously sifted, yielded no further clues regarding the instrument of death. This absence of conventional evidence deepened the mystery, pushing the investigators into unfamiliar territory, where the mundane facts of a homicide blurred with the unsettling implications of the ancient artifact. The investigators were left to piece together a narrative from fragmented bones, a broken radio, a concealed pendant, and an arrowhead that seemed to whisper tales from a forgotten past. The traditional investigative tools felt inadequate against such a confluence of modern tragedy and ancient mystery. The narrative of Silas Blackwood's last moments remained shrouded, his violent and silent testament to a confrontation that left no obvious perpetrator, no clear motive, and no witnesses save for the impassive trees. The forest, having finally relinquished its terrible secret, now seemed to mock their efforts, revealing just enough to confirm a horror, but not enough to explain it. The cold trail had indeed warmed, but it now led down a path less traveled, into the shadowy realm where history, motive, and murder intertwined in a profoundly disturbing tapestry. The horrifying discovery under the ancient oak had merely opened the door to a far more unsettling line of inquiry. The investigation, now officially classified as a homicide, took an immediate and dramatic turn. The initial theory of a random act of violence, a tragic encounter with an unknown assailant, began to unravel under the unsettling weight of the unearthed arrowhead. Sheriff Brody, despite his initial skepticism, could not ignore the increasingly compelling arguments presented by Dr. Finch. The professor, armed with his encyclopedic knowledge of regional history and Native American ethnography, posited a theory so outlandish, yet strangely resonant with the eerie silence of the Appalachian wilderness, that it forced a reluctant reconsideration of all assumptions. He spoke of an ancient, almost forgotten legend of the Cherokee, a tale of the keepers of the Whispering Woods. This was not a formal tribal group, but a loose, elusive collective said to guard sacred ancestral lands from desecration, punishing those who trespassed with swift, often brutal, retribution. Their methods, the legend recounted, were primitive and symbolic, using ancient tools and leaving behind cryptic markers. The presence of the arrowhead, specifically identified by Dr. Finch as a type used for hunting large game by these ancient peoples, was too precise, too deliberate, to be mere coincidence. It felt like a calling card, a chilling message left for anyone who dared to listen. The idea that a contemporary killing could be intertwined with ancient, almost mythical beliefs was profoundly unsettling. It defied modern criminological understanding, yet the physical evidence, or rather, the lack of conventional evidence, seemed to support it. No shell casings, no signs of modern weaponry. The scene felt ritualistic. Alara Blackwood, initially overwhelmed by the confirmation of Silas's death, was now consumed by a fresh wave of terror. The thought that her husband, a man of simple pleasures and deep respect for nature, could have fallen victim to such an arcane, almost supernatural, force was horrifying. Lily, whose youthful innocence had already been shattered, now faced a new, incomprehensible layer of dread. The forest, once a playground of childhood memories, transformed into a sinister entity, an ancient force capable of striking without warning or reason. The community, once resigned to the narrative of a lost hunter, now whispered fearfully of curses, of ancient spirits awakened, of a justice meted out from beyond the veil of time. The Appalachian Mountains, for all their beauty, had always harbored a darker, mystical reputation, and this case seemed to confirm every chilling tale. As the investigators delved deeper into the possible implications of the arrowhead, they expanded their search beyond the immediate vicinity of the ancient oak. They combed through online forums dedicated to local folklore, interviewed elderly residents who remembered whispers of these keepers, and consulted with cultural anthropologists specializing in Appalachian history. What they uncovered was a disturbing tapestry of anecdotal evidence and persistent local legends. There were stories of mysterious disappearances in remote areas, of hunters found with strange, unidentifiable injuries, of warning symbols left etched into trees near sacred sites. These had always been dismissed as tall tales, products of isolated communities and vivid imaginations. Now, they took on a terrifying new significance. Could Silas Blackwood have stumbled upon a truly sacred site, an ancient burial ground, or a ceremonial space, unknowingly violating an unspoken, ancient law? And if so, who were these modern-day keepers, and how had they preserved their anachronistic beliefs and methods into the 21st century? The thought that such a group could exist, operating in the shadows of modern society, yet adhering to practices thousands of years old, was a profoundly disturbing revelation. The investigation, therefore, shifted from traditional forensics to a more anthropological and psychological approach. Detectives began to interview eccentric hermits living deep in the woods, individuals known for their reclusiveness and their fervent beliefs in ancient ways. They spoke to members of obscure environmental groups, some of whom held radical views on land preservation and the sanctity of wilderness. They cast a wide net, understanding that the perpetrator, if indeed following such a belief system, would likely be an outlier, an individual or a small group living on the fringes of society, driven by an ideology far removed from contemporary norms. The silence of the forest, which had initially been a barrier, now felt like a collaborator, a vast, indifferent entity guarding the secrets of the keepers. The case of Silas Blackwood was no longer just a missing person or a murder. It had evolved into a chilling exploration of the clash between modern civilization and ancient traditions, between the visible world and the unseen forces that still held sway in the forgotten corners of the American wilderness. The horrifying discovery under the ancient oak had cracked open a Pandora's box, revealing a darkness far more profound and ancient than anyone could have ever anticipated. The Appalachians, it seemed, still held secrets that defied explanation and punished those who dared to uncover them. The revelation of the arrowhead's significance and the emerging theory of the keepers of the Whispering Woods plunged the investigation into an unprecedented and chilling phase. Sheriff Brody, once a man tethered firmly to the quantifiable facts of forensic science, found himself navigating a nebulous realm where ancient legends and modern crime converged. The local press, initially captivated by the tragic return of Silas Blackwood, was now gripped by a sensational narrative that veered into the mystical and macabre. Stories of ancient curses, hidden cults, and vengeful spirits began to dominate headlines, fanning the flames of fear and unsettling a community already grappling with profound loss. For Alara Blackwood, the shift in the investigation was a cruel twist. The notion that her husband's death might be tied to some ancient, almost supernatural, retribution was almost harder to bear than the thought of a common criminal. It imbued Silas's final moments with a sense of cosmic injustice, a terror that transcended the human realm. Lily, struggling to process the newfound horror, retreated further into herself, her vibrant spirit dimmed by the suffocating weight of this incomprehensible tragedy. The silhouette of the ancient oak, once a vague landmark in their grief, now loomed in her nightmares, a symbol of an unknowable evil. Detectives, under the increasingly strained leadership of Sheriff Brody, began to meticulously cross-reference known disappearances and unsolved cases from the past century with the locations of suspected ancient sites and areas designated as sacred and local folklore. They discovered a disturbing pattern. A handful of other individuals, mostly hunters or hikers, had vanished or been found deceased under similarly perplexing circumstances in remote, hard-to-reach sections of the Appalachians over the decades. In each instance, conventional explanations had proven insufficient, and the cases had ultimately gone cold, attributed to the inherent dangers of the wilderness. Now, through the chilling lens of the keeper theory, these seemingly isolated incidents began to coalesce into a terrifying, unacknowledged history of a persistent, unseen force. They spoke to historians, anthropologists, and even self-proclaimed local seers, each conversation adding another layer to the increasingly complex and disturbing tapestry of fear. One elderly historian, a reclusive academic living in a cabin deep within the mountains, shared obscure oral traditions passed down through generations. These tales spoke not of a unified tribe, but of small, disparate families fiercely protective of their ancestral lands, who sometimes intermarried with early European settlers, preserving their ancient ways in isolation. They held a profound reverence for specific trees, rock formations, and water sources, believing them to be gateways to the spirit world, and held a zero-tolerance policy for those who defiled them. The search expanded beyond human perpetrators. While a rational explanation was still paramount, the chilling possibility of an orchestrated, symbolic act, rooted in an archaic belief system, forced the investigators to consider every angle, no matter how improbable. They canvassed remote, self-sufficient homesteads, communities living off the grid, whose inhabitants often viewed outsiders with deep suspicion. They conducted discreet interviews, searching for individuals who exhibited an unusual reverence for ancient Native American practices or an extreme, almost zealous, possessiveness over particular sections of the wilderness. The psychological profile of such a perpetrator began to emerge. Likely someone deeply isolated, perhaps suffering from a profound disengagement from modern society, who had embraced an idealized, fundamentalist interpretation of ancient traditions. This individual, or group, would view themselves not as murderers, but as protectors executing a sacred duty. The very act of killing, in their twisted logic, would be a ritual, a restoration of balance, a cleansing of desecration. The cold, hard facts of forensic evidence continued to be analyzed, but now through a different filter. The broken radio antenna, once suggesting a struggle, now hinted at a deliberate act to silence communication, to sever the victim's connection to the modern world before the symbolic punishment commenced. The hidden pendant, a personal item left behind, could be interpreted not as a casual loss, but as a deliberate offering, a symbolic tribute to the earth or a warning to others. Every detail, however small, now held the potential for dual meaning, oscillating between the rational and the ritualistic. The silence of the forest, once merely an environmental condition, transformed into a palpable presence, a conspirator in the unfolding horror. It guarded its secrets with an impenetrable embrace, revealing only tantalizing fragments that deepened the terror rather than providing solace. The community, once united in their grief for Silas, now splintered, some succumbing to fear and superstition, others clinging desperately to the hope of a rational explanation. The horrifying discovery under the ancient oak had not only brought Silas Blackwood home, but had also dragged the entire community into the shadowy, unsettling depths of a mystery that threatened to redefine their understanding of justice, wilderness, and the very nature of evil itself. The Appalachians, it seemed, still held ancient grievances, and some were willing to commit the most heinous acts to ensure they were never forgotten. As the weeks turned into months, and the initial wave of sensationalism began to recede, the deeper implications of the keeper theory continued to gnaw at the edges of the investigation. Sheriff Brody found himself in a constant tug-of-war between the tangible, legal demands of a homicide case and the almost mythical, cultural nuances brought forth by Dr. Finch. The local community, too, remained deeply divided. Some, primarily the younger generations, dismissed the ancient legends as fanciful folklore, clinging to the belief that Silas Blackwood's killer must be a conventional criminal, albeit one operating with chilling cunning. Others, particularly the older residents whose lives were inextricably linked to the mountains, felt a profound unease, a resurgence of ancestral fears that had long lain dormant. The very air in the Appalachians seemed to thicken with unspoken anxieties, with a heightened awareness of the unseen forces that had always been whispered about in hushed tones around crackling fires. For Alara and Lily, the ambiguity was a prolonged agony. To imagine Silas dying at the hands of a common murderer, driven by greed or rage, was one horror. To envision him as a sacrificial victim in some ancient, twisted ritual was an entirely different, more profound terror, one that cast a shadow not just over his memory, but over the very landscape they called home. The investigative team, under pressure to deliver answers, pursued all available leads with renewed vigor. They identified several individuals in the deeper, more isolated hollows who fit the loose profile of someone potentially adhering to extreme ancestral beliefs. There was Jedediah Thorne, a reclusive elder who lived alone in a cabin built into a mountainside, known for his fierce protection of specific ancient rock formations on his property. He practiced a form of animism, believing that the spirits of the ancestors resided in the very trees and stones. Then there was the Green River Commune, a small, self-sufficient group that had settled deep within the national forest, advocating for a return to pre-industrial, indigenous ways of life, and openly condemning modern encroachment on wilderness lands. Their rhetoric, while not overtly violent, sometimes bordered on the zealous, speaking of the earth's justice and the cleansing of polluters. These were not suspects in the traditional sense. There was no direct evidence linking them to Silas Blackwood. But their ideologies, their profound isolation, and their unusual reverence for ancient ways made them persons of interest in a case that had already defied conventional logic. Under the guise of environmental surveys or genealogical research, detectives paid discreet visits to these communities. They observed, they listened, they gathered fragments of information, piecing together a mosaic of belief systems and practices that were far removed from mainstream society. They learned of specific sacred hunting grounds, ancient water sources believed to possess healing or punitive powers, and specific rituals performed during the autumnal equinox, the very time Silas Blackwood had vanished. They discovered that within some of these isolated pockets, the concept of trespass carried a far heavier weight than in the legal code of the modern world. It was not merely a violation of property. It was a sacrilege, a spiritual affront to the land and its ancient guardians. The punishment for such an act, according to some of the old stories, was to be returned to the earth, a phrase that now echoed with chilling resonance, given the desecrated remains found under the ancient oak. The absence of a conventional burial site, the scattering of Silas's bones, and the symbolic leaving of the arrowhead now felt less like the haphazard act of a killer and more like a carefully executed, albeit horrific, ritual. The forensic anthropologists continued their painstaking work, focusing on the bone fragments for any subtle marks or patterns that might indicate the use of primitive weaponry or specific ritualistic practices. They found minute etchings on some of the larger bone fragments, barely discernible to the naked eye, that resembled ancient symbols, almost like a crude pictograph. These were sent to an expert in Native American symbolism, who cautiously suggested they might represent purification or an offering to the earth. This discovery, while not conclusive proof of a ritualistic killing, further deepened the unsettling theory. It suggested not only that Silas Blackwood had been killed by someone adhering to these ancient beliefs, but that his body had been treated in accordance with those beliefs, a final, chilling act of symbolic justice. The investigation was no longer about finding a killer and a motive in the traditional sense. It was about deciphering a hidden language, understanding a belief system that had, through the horrifying death of Silas Blackwood, brutally asserted its enduring presence in the modern world. The ancient oak, having silently held its secret for 5 years, now stood as a grim monument to a truth far more terrifying and profound than anyone had ever imagined. A truth whispered by the wind through its ancient leaves, a chilling tale of boundaries transgressed and ancient debts repaid in blood. The long, torturous journey to uncover the truth of Silas Blackwood's disappearance culminated not in a dramatic arrest, but in a profound and unsettling revelation that fractured the community's understanding of justice and wilderness alike. The cumulative weight of evidence, the distinctive ancient arrowhead, the symbolic arrangement of the cairn, the subtle etchings on the bone fragments, and the consistent thread of local legends regarding the keepers of the Whispering Woods began to coalesce into a chillingly coherent narrative.